What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my Cleric build for Baldur's Gate 3 that I used for my second playthrough on Tactician mode, which I am calling the Terror of Tiamat. I'm going to be playing through this game many times for the 100% review, though realistically I only need like one more playthrough for the achievements, but that is hardly everything when it comes to this game. But that said, I'm trying to make build videos of each of my playthroughs as people have asked me to do, and today I've got a particularly interesting one because I of course used it for the hardest difficulty the game has to offer, but it combined a lot of parts of the game to come up with a build that was really fun, though it is very much so a bit power gamey in comparison to my previous build video that we did for the first run. And while it's not completely min-maxed, it was more than enough for Tactician mode. So let me give an overview of what I had in mind here. Initially, I was just planning on playing the game as a Cleric. However, in the early access version, you could play as a Cleric of one of the dead three. In the launch version, they removed those three gods. So I was just trying to play a Cleric of an evil deity for my evil playthrough, and I settled on Tiamat, an evil dragon god, and then I rolled with a blue dragonborn Tempest Cleric, just trying to make use of all of the lightning damage there. But a couple levels into it, that morphed into something much more specific, kind of on accident. And the general gist of it is we're going to be combining multiple abilities and effects to load all of our power into a single melee strike that we can do once per long rest initially, but twice in the later game, that crits for anywhere from about 100 to 250 damage depending on the resistances of the enemy. And even on Tactician, throughout Acts 1 and 2, that's usually enough to one-shot bosses. However, we can only do that a couple of times per long rest. So in every other fight, what you're basically doing is being an AoE spellcaster, courtesy of our Tempest Cleric domain, which is going to give us access to all sorts of AoE damage. And in general, being a Cleric is a good way to go, thanks to all of their ingrained support spellcasting on top of that. So that's kind of a general overview of how this worked. Now, to get into the weeds of it a little bit and start being much more specific, first I want to talk about multiclassing a little bit. This build utilizes two levels of Paladin. However, thanks to the fact that we are a Tempest Cleric as well, I would say the one drawback of this really is that we're only going to get one big melee attack per turn, and we have some ways to pretty much guarantee that it's a hit, and thanks to the massive critical damage we're doing, that felt worth it to me. However, because we're relying on that melee attack, some people might want to take an extra attack, but in order to do that, we would have to take Paladin to level 5, which is simply a lot more levels than we need to do what we're doing. However, if you wanted to play Cleric 7 and Paladin 5, you could do that, but you're going to lose a lot of the later game spells for our Cleric domain. And that's a problem because 2 levels of Paladin and 10 levels of Cleric will actually get you 6th level spells, albeit 1 cast per day, outside of using an item or something to recharge it. So to be clear, what we're doing with this build is pouring a bunch of resources to make that one gigantic critical, and then again possibly later 2 in the late game. And then the rest of the time we're pretty much an AoE spellcaster. So if you want to do the 5 levels in Paladin for extra attack, you can do that, and you should be okay for the most part, but because what we are doing here is limited per day anyway, I much preferred the spellcasting. So I would not recommend it, and I just wanted to touch on that at some point in the video here, which is what this is. From there though, let's talk about character creation. I went with a blue dragonborn to get their lightning breath, which I thought was very thematic to what we were doing. However, if you want the absolute min-max option, technically what you would want here is a half-orc thanks to their savage attack racial passive, which gives them extra dice rolls on melee weapon criticals, and since we're going to be guaranteeing those criticals, you would get good use out of that. So even with my power game build, I decided to be a little more roleplay focused and go with the blue dragonborn. But thanks to the fact that both Tempest Cleric and Paladin both get pretty much every proficiency in terms of weapons and armor, the only thing that really matters for the race is what you want to pick. But technically half-orc would give us a little more damage to the specific thing we are doing, but I didn't find it super necessary. With that in mind though, we are going Tempest Cleric. That is incredibly important, as this is going to give us our heavy armor proficiency as well as melee weapon proficiency, though we will just be using a mace throughout most of the game as we are going sword and board. I guess mace and board technically, but you know what I mean. Right away at level 1, Tempest Clerics are going to be able to, as a reaction, hit people with lightning or thunder damage, which is just a nice ability in the early game, but realistically you won't be using it a ton later. But the other big thing Tempest Cleric domain gets is their domain spells, which for the most part are large, sort of storm-based AoEs, things like Thunder Wave, Ice Storm, Sleet Storm, Insect Swarm, just to name a few, which are fantastic AoEs we'll be making a lot of use of later. So Tempest Domain is everything we want for this. Now, when it comes to our cantrips, for the most part you could choose whatever you wanted here, but Sacred Flame and Guidance are always the way to go on a cleric in my opinion, with the third one being whatever you want. Now, when it comes to deities, while I chose Tiamat because I was doing an evil dragon run, if you wanted to play this with a more good aligned character, you could just pick a different god like Bahamut or Talos even. They would also fit the theme here really well, and truth be told, the only thing deity actually affects in the game is various dialogue choices, and even some of those overlap, so I wouldn't be super concerned about it. Now, for our background, this is, again, mostly dealer's choice. I personally went with Folk Hero because I like animal handling and survival, but what you're actually picking here is essentially what skills you're going to be good at. So pick whatever lines up with Wisdom or Strength, as those are going to be our main focus, and you'll be good to go. But again, personally, I liked Folk Hero. Now that brings us to our ability scores. Technically, you have some wiggle room here, but an important thing to note right away is that as we're leveling up, because we are taking 2 levels of Paladin, we are only going to get 2 ability score improvements. But for the most part, our stats are going to be split between Strength and Wisdom. We need Strength because we are using a mace, and we actually do need that attack roll to hit, and Wisdom is for all of our spell casting. So to start with here at character creation, we're going to take Charisma down to 8, we don't need it for anything. Wisdom should be up to 17 with our +2. Intelligence can be a base 10. Constitution at 13. Dexterity at 10 because we are not using it for anything, and Strength for 16. Now, the downside to this spread is that we're not putting anything in Dexterity because we're not going to get any extra AC from it, as we will be using heavy armor. However, Dexterity is also used as a bonus to your initiative, which means that many times we can be going last, or close to last, or further down the initiative order than you might like. There are ways to buff this outside of your stats, such as potions, certain items, or just anything that gives you an initiative bonus, really. So this isn't the only thing to manage here, but do keep in mind if you don't buff that in-game, you'll be starting pretty low on the pecking order in terms of turn-based combat. But then we have Strength at 16. Again, this is to make our melee weapons connect, as we do actually have to make our attack rolls in a lot of cases. And with our ability score improvements later, we should still have like an 80 to 90% chance to hit most of the time. And then for our initial spells as a cleric, Guiding Bolt and Healing Words are the main one I would suggest, but it's not wildly necessary to worry about that just yet. Because as we move to the leveling up portion of this video, the main, I would say, concern when it comes to leveling up as this character is that the first 4 levels can be a little rocky, because in order to get everything we need to do the thing we want to do, we need to hit level 4, which is going to require us for this build to take 2 levels in Cleric and 2 levels in Paladin. I'm going to explain how I went about doing that, but realistically, as long as you have 2 in each by level 4, it really doesn't matter. But because of this, the early levels on Tactician might be a little rocky depending on what your party composition is and how you're approaching it. Because the main thing this build is going to do does not work until you hit level 4. But for level 2, I went with another Cleric level. This is going to give us Destructive Wrath from our Tempest domain, which is a Channel Divinity ability, which allows us to, with a Channel Divinity charge, maximize the thunder or lightning damage we deal in an attack. This is very important, and beyond just our big gigantic melee critical we're setting up for, is useful for so many of our spells and things. So important to understand how that works. But that is the main thing we're going to pick up at level 2. However, later on, once we get more Cleric levels, you'll get another Channel Divinity charge, which is going to let us do this twice per rest. Now, at level 3 is where I picked up my first level of Paladin. 1 level in Paladin is mostly going to get you Lay on Hands for this, and Lay on hands for us is still very useful because that scales off of your character level and not your paladin level. So that will stay relevant throughout the game, which is nice. And for your paladin oath, I chose vengeance because I was going for an evil-oriented playthrough, but truthfully, the oath does not matter. So if you get Oathbreaker, don't even worry about it, because what we are picking up paladin for is what we get at level 2, which is Divine Smite, which brings us to character level 4, paladin level 2. We get a few really good things for 2 levels of paladin. For starters, Divine Smite. This is one of our main abilities that we're going to be using for this build, and it allows us to deal extra radiant damage on a hit. However, this does extra damage to fiends and undead, and anything vulnerable to radiant damage will take double damage from it, and because we are fighting a lot of undead and fiends in this game, this is very, very useful. But it is just one piece of the puzzle, ultimately. Level 2 Paladin also gets us Thunderous Smite, which is a level 1 spell that does thunder damage on a hit, which we can combine with Divine Smite and our regular melee hit to deal a bunch of damage in a singular hit. And that's the crux of how we are going to pull off our giant melee attack. However, we're still not done yet. We'll get to the rest of that later. Second level Paladin also gets to pick a fighting style. We're going to pick up Dueling as we are going sword and board, so this will just give us extra damage on our hits, which is exactly what we're after. Now, levels 5 through 12, we are switching back to Cleric. I'm only going to talk about the important levels as the bulk of them just give you extra spells as you level up as a Cleric, and we'll cover that shortly. So at level 6, we're going to pick up our first ability score improvement thanks to our multiclassing. You're going to put a single point in Wisdom and a single point in Constitution to bring those up to even numbers and get an extra bonus for both. Then, once we get to level 8, we are going to pick up Thunderous Strike as part of our Tempest Cleric domain. When we hit with thunder or lightning damage, we can knock enemies prone and knock them back a little ways, which can be handy in certain instances, but it's nothing we specifically need. Then at level 10, we'll get our last ability score improvement, and we're going to use this to bring Strength up to 18. Because again, we do need to guarantee that our melee attacks actually connect in certain instances, so the bigger the bonus there, the better. And then lastly, at level 12, we pick up Divine Intervention as our Cleric class ability. Every Cleric gets this, and it allows them to call on their deity for a very powerful boon that they get to use one time. It can heal and restore everyone around you, it can give you a bunch of supplies, it can deal a massive damage wave, so you have a few options there, but do remember you only get to use that once. Now, those are the important things to know as you level up, but we were gaining a lot of spells on the way, and I wanted to talk about those a little bit separately. So, the nice thing about this particular build is that the bulk of the Cleric spells we are going to be using all the time are actually the domain spells, which means we don't have to worry about preparing them because they are our domain spells. They are always ready to cast as long as we have the spell slots to do so. And thanks to our multi-class into a paladin, we will still get a 6th level spell slot, which means we will get almost as many spells as all of the other casters. But as we level up, we can look forward to things like Thunder Wave, Shatter, Sleet Storm, Call Lightning, Ice Storm, Insect Swarm, and Destructive Wave. Most of these are really big AoEs, so when we can't do our big melee wind-up, we're usually going to be laying down these AoEs, though do remember you can hit your allies with this, which is to be avoided. Beyond that though, Clerics also get a fantastic spell list otherwise with things such as the ability to heal. Guiding Bolt is a fantastic early damage spell. Spiritual Weapon, a level 2 spell, helps out with the action economy by summoning a weapon to attack your enemies as a bonus action. And that's to say nothing of spells like Mass Healing Word, which can get all of your characters up from the downed state, Revivify, which can revive people, Spirit Guardians is a favorite at level 3, spell level 3 that is. So there's a lot of stuff. And then on the Paladin side of spellcasting, really the only spell we're concerned with there is Thunderous Smite, which will be always prepared by lieu of the fact that it's the only spell we will be able to prepare as a Paladin, thanks to our low level. So again, you're going to be getting a lot of spells thrown at you, but the main stuff is the stuff that will be from our domain and always prepared anyway, and then just pick and choose what you want from the Cleric spell list. Now, from there, in order to really bring this build together, we have to talk about Illithid powers and gear. There is a single Illithid power we need, but to get it, we have to take 2 Illithid powers total. So if you are trying to do a run without taking any Illithid powers, I wouldn't recommend this build to you, because while you can still do it, it won't be possible until the end of Act 2. Whereas if we take the Illithid power, we'll be doing this towards the end of Act 1, depending on some of your exact choices. But the 2 specific abilities I would recommend are Favorable Beginnings, which makes our first attack roll and ability check against any target get a bonus equal to our proficiency bonus. This is fantastic because A, it's going to mean we hit a single enemy more often, and when you're trying to just nuke one of them, that's essentially just a huge bonus to hit, which we very much so need, but realistically, we're only taking favorable beginnings to pick up Luck of the Far Realms right after it. This is going to, on a successful attack roll, give us the ability to, once per long rest, force a critical hit. So basically, whenever we make a successful attack roll, it will ask us if we want to use Luck of the Far Realms, which we are going to say yes to on boss enemies and the like, to force a critical on Thunderous Smite, which will then trigger Divine Smite for maximum damage on its critical, on top of Thunderous Smite getting maximized from either the critical or Destructive Wrath, either or, and then the weapon attack itself. Thanks to all of these stacking effects, you will hit for about 100 at a minimum, and if the enemy is weak to the thing you are doing, that is to say it's undead or a fiend and takes extra radiant damage from the attack, you're looking more like 150 to 250. And even on Tactician, that's enough to one-shot bosses until you get towards the very end of the game. So that massive attack is before we even start slinging AoE spells once we're done with it. Now, in order to take that a little bit farther, we do need some good gear, though I am going to focus on the gear that is necessary to pull this off, because other than the gear we're about to talk about, really all you need to do is watch out for the best stuff you can find, which should be obvious. So for instance, we want the best heavy armor we can find, we want the best shield we can find, because we are using those things purely for the extra AC, but in particular I like Reaper's Embrace, which drops off of a boss fight later in the game. And then for our boots, those ones actually are pretty important because we can get a pair of Disintegrating Nightwalkers from the Underdark portion of the game, which also drops off a boss of sorts. This gives us a free cast of Misty Step, and because we are relatively low mobility with most of this class, Misty Step is going to allow us to close range if we are far away and get our big attack in. And this also keeps us from being enwebbed, entangled, ensnared, or slipping on grease or ice, which is also incredibly useful. Some of the best boots in the game, in my opinion. But then we have our weapon. For our shield, it's really just the best you can find, but for our weapon, there's a very specific one you want, which you can find in the Mountain Pass area of the game called the Blood of Lathander. This one is hidden behind some puzzles in the Mountain Pass, so I don't want to spoil it too much for people, but explore around there and you should find it. This mace is ridiculous. Once per long rest when we die, it will just auto-revive us and heal people around us for a little bit. It also just sheds holy light naturally, which fiends and undead can then be blinded by, and things like vampires even will take a debuff from this. And because that's, again, the bulk of what we're fighting, that's incredibly good. But if that wasn't enough, we also get a Sunbeam enchantment, which allows us to use a level 6 spell for free once per long rest, which does a bunch of radiant damage, just adding that much more to what we can do. I used this mace from the time I got it through the rest of the game, and you can get this pretty early as the Mountain Pass is towards the end of Act 1. Cannot be overstated how amazing this mace was. And then last but not least, while not strictly necessary, an item that will make our lives much easier and force a second critical for our big melee attack, which is Killer's Sweetheart. This was used in my last build as well, where I had forgotten where I picked it up from, but you can pick this up towards the end of Act 2 in a story-related dungeon, specifically one that involves some trials, and I don't want to spoil it from there, but actually pretty easy to find, and it's kind of directly in your path. But this is amazing because when we kill a creature, our next attack roll will be a critical hit. But again, we can only use this effect once per long rest. So essentially, this means if we use our big hefty melee critical in the later game, kill something with it, we can then activate Executioner, which is going to let us almost immediately do it again the next time our turn rolls around. Very, very useful item. Everything beyond those I would say is really just dealer's choice, but those are the things I would consider crucial to how this works. And all of that finally brings us to the combat section, where if everything has been set up properly, you should just kind of annihilate everyone. Now, the main drawback to this is if you do not have anything buffing your initiative, you're likely going to be pretty far down the turn order because we don't have any dexterity giving us a bonus to our initiative rolls. So a way to offset that before you even start combat would be recommended. Anything that might just buff your dexterity on its own, or an item that boosts your initiative, of which there are a few, would be a good idea. However, in combat, basically what you want to do is use our gigantic critical on the biggest enemy and try to take it down very, very quickly. And again, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to pick Thunderous Smite as the ability we attack with. And then if you use your Destructive Wrath Tempest Cleric ability, you can guarantee the maximized damage on the thunder damage there, though usually the critical hit is enough for that. So you might want to save Destructive Wrath for your other thunder or lightning based spells. But Thunderous Strike, when we use it, is going to trigger our Divine Smite, which will then deal a bunch of radiant damage dependent on the spell slot we use to cast it, whether or not the enemy is a fiend or undead, and then if they are vulnerable to radiant damage. The radiant damage portion of this attack is the most variable, because it really just depends on what the enemy is and what it is weak to. So in some cases, you might only do like 20 to 30 radiant damage, even on the critical, and then in other cases, I've seen it do over 100. And that's before our just even regular melee weapon attack damage. And all of those sources of damage combined are going to give you, again, about a minimum of 100 damage, assuming they aren't weak to what we are doing. If they are weak to what we are doing, 200 to 250 is usually around where it would hit. But again, this is just what we're doing to take out the biggest enemies we are fighting. Towards the late game, with all of our effects and everything, we can potentially do this up to twice. When we are done with that ability and can't do anything else, then we shift our focus to AoE spellcasting. Both as a cleric and a Tempest domain cleric, we are going to get a bunch of AoE spells. This is what you're going to be doing in basically every other instance, and this relies off of our wisdom. So spells like Ice Storm, Insect Swarm, or even just Call Lightning, which can get maximized damage off of our Destructive Wrath Channel Divinity ability, can do some really solid damage. But also, don't forget, we'll have a bunch of support spells at our disposal, which is going to allow us to do things like cast Mass Heal Word or revive other characters, which means in addition to all of our fantastic damage dealing spells, buffed by Destructive Wrath, we can also support our party as necessary. Which means this build tends to oscillate between just annihilating the boss and then supporting our group afterwards while we wipe up the trash mobs. And I found this to be incredibly effective. Most enemies on Tactician don't seem to be set up with this in mind. There's only a few bosses, which are usually just immune to damage period until certain circumstances are met, that this doesn't work against. So while it does take a fair bit of setup to pull this off, I found around the end of Act 1 this got incredibly rewarding and it was really, really fun. And while it's not even min-maxed as far as it could be, I still dominated Tactician difficulty with it. So I hope other people get the enjoyment out of it that I did. But either way, it was a ton of fun. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know what you think about the build down below, of course. And let me know any classes you in particular would love a build for. In the meantime, though, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.